Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We left off last time right at the point of Roger Williams fleeing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so I've aptly titled this Roger Williams Part 2, Life After Massachusetts Bay and Observations. Now, if you'll recall, the magistrates had sent John Underhill to Salem to arrest Roger Williams and put him on a ship back to England. But when he arrived at Williams's house in Salem, he had already been gone 3 days. Roger Williams had caused quite a stir among the other Puritan leaders. If you remember, he challenged the church and state on various levels. He believed in freedom of conscience, the fair acquisition and transfer of property. He believed that it was dangerous to the souls of unbelievers to have them swear an oath to God. His beliefs and teachings were recognized as an assault on church and state. And this sentiment was underscored by Uriah Oakes when he said, quote, "The prosperity of church and commonwealth are twisted together. Break one cord, you weaken and break the other also." End quote. Not so unusual for their day. England had the Anglican Catholic Protestant debate. France had their Huguenots. Spain, the Inquisition. At this very time, all of Europe was ablaze with the 30 Years' War. And everything revolved around the relationship between church and state. For these things, Roger Williams was found to be too incorrigible to keep around. And for today, we want to maybe revisit a few things from another angle in Massachusetts Bay, but we'll focus a lot more on Roger Williams' beliefs, his actions, and the impact that he's actually had historically. Roger Williams was a complex and astute man. He was both an aggravator of the system as well as a capitalizer. So I want to continue our narrative by filling a few blank spots from last time, but again, then focusing on Williams's travels, his plans and the execution of his plans, and finally, some of his views and observations about the native culture. It's in those views and observations that we get a more intimate understanding of the day-to-day life. And there's so many similarities to what we experience even today. And the biggest issue at stake was control. Whether the issue was a legitimate concern for the general public and individual safety could be debated. I mean, I suppose there were good, well-intentioned men who had bought into the overall model that they were building, but I also think there's no doubt that men arose among them who were merely interested in advancing their own power, or the power of the state. And the issue of undermining the state, for example, was more than just ecclesiastical. The leadership in Boston wanted to control land purchases and expansion by royal patent. So when Williams first rejected membership in the Boston Church, that was an insult. But when he challenged the state on how they acquired and purchased land, that was a double whammy. It was very convenient that he was called to Salem when he was. I mean, for clarity's sake, I'm not implying anything nefarious. It was just a convenient thing. Of course, now his ideals would be harder to check. A little background then before we look at some of the movements of Roger Williams before the Exodus, before the arrival. Why or how he thought and acted as he did. It was his past experiences and relationships that probably influenced and emboldened him here in the colonies. Williams was in the colonies several years before he was banished. So he didn't just, trouble started pretty quick, but he didn't just arrive here and face banishment. He also moved around quite a bit. He'd spent about 2 of those years in Plymouth when he first fell out of favor with the Puritans. He arrived in Boston in February of 1631, and as we've said, he turned down joining the Boston Church and went to Salem. By the fall of 1631, he had already left Salem and headed for Plymouth. From what we've already discussed, one might conclude that he may have been a better fit in Plymouth, and so he was, but he also had connections to Plymouth. And he'd spend about 2 years here and only leave after the birth of his first child in August of 1633. He wouldn't be convicted of sedition and heresy for another 2 years. But why did he go to Plymouth? What was there? Williams had not always been a Puritan. That quote-unquote conversion had occurred while he was attending Pembroke College at Cambridge. And upon graduating, he became a private chaplain for Sir Walter Masham. And it was while in this service that Roger met Mary Barnard, who he would marry in 1629. Yes, they were very young and newlyweds when they came to America. They made the trip, like so many others, to escape the reach of Bishop Laud and the High Commission. And here's where the connection to Plymouth comes in. And I might add my question as to why he didn't just go directly to Plymouth and stay. His father-in-law was Richard Barnard. He was a colleague and a friend of men like William Brewster and William Bradford and John Robinson and many others of the Leiden crowd from Holland. Now, Mary had not known these men, but she must have been familiar with them, or at least their names, from her father. And they would be close by once the young couple got to the colonies. And when trouble arose, there they went to Plymouth. Now remember, the issues from last week: freedom of conscience, property rights, and a sensitivity towards man and God. And there they had much in common with the Bradfords and the Brewsters of the bunch. Much more like-minded. Remember, the Pilgrims had been the true separatists, but were actually far more democratic in their governance. They had been forced to accept non-Pilgrims as part of their community right from the start. And they had a strict community, but not as stifling as Massachusetts Bay. So eventually, Williams did end up in Salem again, against the wishes of the General Court of Massachusetts Bay. And at this time, Salem, like other communities, wanted to maintain autonomy from Boston. And here's where the independent-minded Williams and Salem were a match of sorts. Massachusetts Bay, Boston, wanted to control all the land use and expansion. And the argument from Plymouth, was that the royal charter could not convey rights to soil, as that title rested with the native owners. He contended that the land must be purchased from the natives on an individual transaction and purchase basis, free from the oversight of Boston. Roger Williams detested what he considered the, quote, depraved, now listen to this, the depraved appetite after the great vanities, dreams and shadows of this vanishing life. Great portions of land in this wilderness, as if men were in as great necessity and danger for want of great portions of land as poor, hungry, thirsty seamen have, after a sick and stormy, a long and starving passage. This is one of the gods of New England, which the living and Most High Eternal will destroy and famish, end quote. Did you catch that? He said that the lust for land found in the leadership of Massachusetts Bay, and more dominantly in Boston, was a depraved appetite. This underscores the business side of the whole affair. Historians have generally opted to adopt John Winthrop's account of affairs over Williams at this time. And my guess is it's because that narrative is and was more palatable to the general reader. Thus, these controversies have largely been unknown, or at least the extent of these controversies. If nothing else, this certainly does eradicate the one-size-fits-all approach to the Puritan oligarchy. Like any other group, there were always dissenters and apologists. Often, our cultural perception is forged more by who framed the argument than a comprehensive understanding. This was more of a European matter and issue of degrees. In his Key to the Language of America, Williams denounced the, quote, sinful opinion amongst many that Christians have a right to heathen lands, end quote. Did you see that? He wrote a book, and in that he said that the sinful opinion amongst many Christians have a right to heathen lands was wrong. This is a little misleading. It's true, the Catholic position had evolved that way. You remember when we went over that. And worse would happen in the future, but for now, the disputes on land purchases and control were within the English camp, and nobody at this point was looking to steal native land. They were looking to claim empty space or to buy that which was occupied. The issue was the control of these purchases that Boston demanded, as evidenced by John Cotton's reply in his book, The Bloody Tenant Washed and Made White in the Blood of the Lamb, where he said, quote, it was neither the king's intentment nor the English planters to take possession of the country by murder of the natives or by robbery, but either to take possession of the void places of the country by the law of nature, for vacuum domicilium, credit occupant, or if we took any lands from the natives, it was by way of purchase and free consent, end quote. Now, just to clear this up a little bit, vacuum domicilium was a standard European theory at this time. What it allowed for was the occupation of deserted or desolate lands for which payment might be made if any native subsequently claimed ownership. Now, you remember the Catholic approach about 100 years earlier was to take anything non-Christian for their own. But there's two things that strike me about this vacuum domicilium and the concept that was emerging. There's two things here to keep in mind. The first one is that it's not a reasonable conclusion to draw that once established, anybody's going to actually voluntarily move or pay for land that they're already occupying. And secondly, the concept of establishing colonies then was the legal document or charter secured by the king and the practical activity, the on-site of making the direct purchase. So it does become understandable under this model. Again, you get issued a charter by the king, and then the second part of that is to find voided land or land that you're able to purchase. So under this model as to why, when the population grew and looked to expand, it simply expanded. I mean, think about it. You've got to get a charter from a guy across the ocean for land he'll never see and probably doesn't care about. And then you've got to find the people you can buy it from. So again, even legitimate consideration of quote-unquote current land ownership. I mean, the likes of Connecticut proper, New Haven, even Williams's Rhode Island was done in reverse order when he purchased land from the natives, but it was only years later that he secured the necessary charter. This is not a theoretical discussion. Some of these early colonies ceased to exist because of their lack of charter. A few decades later in this narrative, Charles II would really rein in the colonies, and there would be consequences for doing things their own way. John Cotton also denounced the idea that Christians have a right to simply take the lands of others. So these were ongoing wars of words and rhetoric, kind of ironing out a new process in a new land. But even with the banishment and these wars of words, these men remained friends for the rest of their lives. So the general court's response was predictable. First, they passed a law that prohibited the purchase of native lands without the court's prior approval. That general court, you remember, is in Boston. And to make matters worse, they also conducted a survey and a registry of the land. They made it clear that no other entity but them could distribute the land. And lastly, they expected all freemen to essentially proclaim allegiance to them and not to the Crown of England. Frankly, that's treason. All allegiance to Boston, above and beyond even local towns. That's a very sneaky and vindictive piece of legislation. This officially made Williams and Salem belligerent in the eyes of the magistrates. Remember, they weren't allowed to have these opinions, and they weren't allowed to make land purchases now, and everything had been surveyed. Boston knew exactly what was going on, theoretically, from a land ownership perspective. So Williams and Salem were now belligerent from a legal standpoint. And again, Salem may have been a part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but they wanted to compete with Boston, not prostrate themselves to it. So this war of words and ideology continued and escalated until the magistrates from Salem were simply expelled from the general court, and Williams was brought before the court, and ultimately a sentence of banishment was proclaimed. That's where we ended last week. I hope this helped to fill in some of the blank areas. There's one more thing here. After Williams fled, Salem backed down. Without their leader to provoke and encourage, it seems that they did cross their own consciences and they avoided the beaten, as reference to last week's look at Martin Luther and Aaron Tippin. And so it was, with his firebrand style and staunch, immovable personal convictions, Roger Williams entered today's Rhode Island. Now, Roger Williams was a friend to both Massasoit, the Wampanoag Sachem who had helped Plymouth, and Canonicus, the Sachem of the Narragansett tribe, who happened to be an adversary of Massasoit. Remember, early on in the Plymouth experiment, Canonicus had conspired against Massasoit and the Pilgrims with Corbitant, who was really a dissatisfied underling of Massasoit. It all gets very messy. I want to try and present this a narrative in a way that we don't get too tangled up in exactly which guy did what right away. I mean, we want to learn these names gradually because it's really the people groups, either the various native tribes or the groups of Englishmen that we want to keep an eye on. But just so that we're understanding this, Roger Williams was a friend to both of the major sachems in the area, Massasoit and his nemesis, Canonicus. And Roger Williams was not opposed to purchasing land from the natives. He was opposed to unfair purchases or claims of land, and he was opposed to Boston sticking their finger in everything. So Roger Williams bought land from Canonicus, maybe as much as a year prior to his banishment. Frankly, that may explain why he didn't care for a lot of the legislation coming out of Boston. He was already buying land for himself. But later, when he was warned by John Winthrop of the impending danger, he went first to Sawamet, Massasoit's town, where he purchased land on the Seekonk River. It's now the Rehoboth. It's funny how he sought and was given asylum with both of the main sachems of the area. That must have aggravated the English. Well, after the purchase of land from Massasoit, Governor Winslow of Plymouth, so he was warned by Winthrop of Massachusetts Bay to get out, and he did. He went and lived with Massasoit. But then once he purchased land from Massasoit, which is right near Plymouth, Governor Winslow of Plymouth suggested that he move to the west side of that river, outside of Plymouth even. So I don't know, maybe he's avoiding conflict with Massachusetts Bay. Maybe he just didn't like the idea of Roger Williams bringing this turmoil. But at any rate, that's the beginning of the Providence Plantation, because it wasn't just crossing the river. It wasn't just leaving Plymouth. It was leaving the land of Massasoit and the Wampanoags and entering the land of Canonicus and the Narragansetts. They had sold this land as well. So Roger Williams, he got around. I can almost feel the contempt of the folks in Boston and what they must have felt for him at this point. Now, once settled, Williams quickly took control of the trade on the Narragansett Bay. He took it away from the Pilgrims. It's not a thing to recommend among friends. His trading post was Wickford Harbor, and it was on the western shore. Williams was an early observer and recorder of native life. He got along pretty good with them. And he was one of the Puritans who, especially early on, believed the natives were of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So, lost, but special. Again, a view that was held by many on both sides of the Atlantic. Fellow colonials like Edward Winslow and John Davenport. And remember, we spoke before of the book by Reverend Thomas Thorogood from England entitled Jews in America, or Probability that the American are of that race. Williams recorded many observations, one of which was that the Narragansetts claimed 38 separate deities. They had priests and holy men, powerful men among the people. They recognized the mortality of the soul, but not the resurrection in a Christian sense. Of course, their views varied between groups as well. They were hospitable even to strangers. They were willing to help people in need, and their wars were less bloody than European wars. They were fair-skinned, intelligent, ingenious, but illiterate. And that was a big mark against them as a society from a Puritan perspective. Remember, these guys worshiped God and they built colleges everywhere. The everyday village and societal life was also an area of interest for Roger Williams. Roger Williams saw an organized culture in the natives. He saw pretty clearly defined roles. The women were industrious. They kept the home. They raised the children. They tended the fields. They prepared the food. They gathered the seashells for the wampum production. And wampum production was open to everybody. It was not a closed market. Everybody could engage and profit from this multi-purpose commodity. Both the men and the women shared in the production of tools and utensils. The men were the protectors and hunters. In the winter, they would carve wooden spoons and bowls, they would shape clay pots, and they repaired damaged weapons, and they made new ones. They built canoes. There were two basic types of canoes that were used by these Indians. There were the big, long, heavy log dugouts that were capable of transporting up to 40 men. That's a good-sized canoe. And there were the birch bark canoes. Those consisted of sheets of bark that were sewn onto a light wooden frame that were used for hunting or fishing expeditions. If you remember that failed colony of Wessagosset, as they were starving to death, they had been selling their services one winter to produce canoes for the natives. And then we found out later that in that specific example, they were actually building the canoes that were planned to eventually attack their ship, the Swan, and help to destroy the colony. So these canoes were sometimes used for naval battles, some of which boasted 30 to 40 vessels per side. I've got to admit, that would have been interesting to see, a naval battle without gunpowder from canoes. The men appeared to enjoy more leisure time. They smoked, they played games, they hunted and trapped and fished. Their hunting and fishing tactics were intentional. That is to say, the idea that they just went out and randomly were looking for game isn't true. They would drive the game toward a narrowing hedgerow and wait for them to emerge at the narrow end for an easier kill. And when it came to fishing, they would often use nets. Spearing and line fishing were also practiced. They did that sometimes just for sport. They kept busy and in shape through athletics. I mean, doesn't this sound a lot like our modern society? Activities like running and archery and swimming, they played team sports too. One game was almost like football, with goalposts about a mile apart across a level playing field. And these were serious games, often attracting large crowds. The men would dress in war paint and they would play for days. Often these games took the place of war itself. And they would gamble. They loved to gamble. It was not uncommon for a man to lose everything, even the sachems, although they had the unique ability to levy taxes and recoup their losses. This was not an activity that was appreciated by the Puritans. Now, tribal boundaries were well established and acknowledged by everybody, just like the Europeans. And sales and transfers of land were common. The real issue, it seems to me, was how ownership looked and how the land was managed. Natives, even those woodland tribes of the New England region with more permanent villages, seemed to live on the land with a certain sense of preservation. Probably not to the extent that we imagine today. I mean, there are some native practices that have been noted and observed by the Europeans that were anything but preservation-minded. That's a story for another day. It was because of his separate location and extensive interaction with the various natives of the region that Roger Williams is still a dependable source of information about those natives. I mean, make no mistake, he was a European. And as I said before, many of the disagreements that he may have had with the others were generally by degrees and not wholesale. It was because of his relationship with the natives that he was used by the folks in Boston for their own communications and interactions with those people groups. One prime example of his usefulness as an interpreter was when, in the course of events to come, in a little while in our own narrative, tensions arose between the English and the Pequot Nation. It was Williams who was called into service by the Massachusetts Bay Colony to act as their ambassador of sorts. Even though he'd been banished and Rhode Island would not be considered a Puritan colony, he was friendly with them. I mean, it's kind of an odd relationship to me. But it was Williams that competed with the Pequot emissaries for the Narragansett support. And he would succeed. And that success would lead to the utter destruction of the most powerful native tribe in the lower New England landscape. Roger Williams was instrumental in persuading Miantonomato and Canonicus and others to compact with Massachusetts Bay in October of 1636, an agreement that was sealed 5 months later with 40 fathoms of wampum and a Pequot hand. That's a great seal for a contract, isn't it? Blood and money. And again, think of the people involved. These are Puritans, worshipers of God, civilized Europeans dealing with the savages, whose pledge and bond was cemented by blood and money. Some things never change. Some things just always are. But then when tension arose later with the Narragansetts, Williams would not be allowed to travel to Boston with Miantonomo, the Narragansett sachem, because of the previous banishment. So he remained friendly and useful to Massachusetts Bay, but he was still a banished man. Strange times. Diplomacy of any and all ages is a difficult thing to explain. It's a difficult thing to navigate. Diplomacy is a difficult thing to understand. I try to keep that in mind when I listen to contemporary commentary of controversial foreign or domestic policies, how they're ironed out and implemented. I mean, so often we come to the discussion with preloaded, predigested narratives, and our conclusion is drawn before we hear the facts. Ignorance combined with Washington's grazing multitude mentality. I mean, we seem to be sold a narrative, and we seem to also eagerly buy into it. So from a religious mindset or a missionary approach, Roger Williams' stated convictions did not match the times either. No doubt the idea and actions toward missions was poor in the land, if that was ever actually an intended activity. But through Roger Williams, we can again gain a pretty clear view of the reality of the kind of boots on the ground experience. And keep in mind, Roger Williams was steadfast in his own convictions. He was steadfast in his own doctrine, and he was steadfast in his own worship of God. I can't say what a day-to-day conversation with him may have looked like or sounded like, but he both embodied his convictions personally and extended them to others. I think I've got a lot in common with him. Maybe you do too. But the main point already developed was freedom of conscience. If we live as we believe, more often than not, our true character does reveal itself. Successes can often define the person. And this is not an endorsement of situational ethics so much as a practicality and the recognition that living strictly by ideals, this side of paradise, often proves impossible. It breeds hypocrisy. And mistakes and times of trial or regrets can be swallowed up in the larger narrative of our own lives. I hate the focused character assassination or the justified in all things approach that's held by so many in our day. Okay, so that's the end of my soapbox. There's a hard stop here on these qualifications. But that being said, the two areas that I want to briefly address in the area of religion are one, Roger Williams' actions around false worship, and two, his opinions about conversion, namely verbal affirmation and intentional activities versus genuine conversion. And this is important. Remember, he was a Puritan and a friend to the Pilgrims at Plymouth. And I know this gets a little dicey, but I think this is important for our narrative. Roger Williams was not into strong-arming the natives on religious matters. He believed, quote, superficial conversion was worse than useless, end quote. And in 1643, he wrote Key to the Language of America, where he said that he could have persuaded the Narragansetts to observe the Sabbath, submit to baptism, and practice outward faith, but recognize this as useless activity without true repentance. And he followed that up 2 years later in 1645 with Christianings Make Not Christians, a brief discourse concerning that name heathen commonly given to the Indians. This was published in London, not the colonies, and Williams reminded his readers that conversion was more than turning from idols in conversation, and that the Indians were no more heathen than most Europeans. Now consider that message not in today's world where the church is inundated with bad and conflicting doctrine, and the world celebrates heathenism in a classic Christian Western world sense. I mean, no offense is meant there. This is a deeper conversation, the exercise of reading comprehension, one in which all parties ought to be prepared to discuss the actual context of the written word. I mean, frankly, if you're going to offer a critique of any book or idea, you owe it to yourself as much as your audience to at least familiarize yourself with the text. Otherwise, you'll be exposed to those who have. From a strictly contextual, biblical position, the modern church in the West is a mess. Often, the biblically illiterate unbeliever will mock biblical teaching that frankly doesn't exist, and the biblically illiterate professing believer obliges this ignorance by heaping more of their own on top. The fine art of self-justification. Anyways, Williams' published views are right in line with his controversies in the colonies, namely, chiefest, freedom of conscience. Now, in a bit, we'll see exactly why this is important to develop here. There's an evolving thought process taking place in Roger Williams over these years, which I suspect has as much to do with personal experience as thoughtful reasoning. He was a real firebrand, an agitator for his age, for his time. Think about the difficulty that may have presented itself. No written language to transfer ideas, few common cultural experiences. The idea of missionary work would be more complicated than someone sitting safely in England might ever have expected. Either way, if there was a scorecard for Christian conversions being kept, Rhode Island's track record was abysmal. In 1674, Daniel Gookin's survey of missionary progress reported that he knew of no conversions in Rhode Island. Now, all apologies if all of this religious talk and focus is uncomfortable, either because you don't like it or you don't like the tone the conversation is taken. But this is the conversation that they were having back then, and it's a part of our conversation that is essential if we're to really understand the folks and the time frame that we're examining. Our aim is not to be exhaustive. I mean, as if you could, right? But it's got to be comprehensive enough to work through the bigger issues as they begin to roll themselves out, as time continues for these folks and a track record emerges on all sorts of topics. Needless to say, one encouraging thing worth noting here is that they, meaning all the primary players of the story today, were able to coexist without worshiping together. And I'm talking about a collective society or recognizable, larger community, not the idea of everybody going to the same house of worship. Because there's a time and a place to air grievances and separate over differences. But I believe those times are often fewer and farther between than we make them out to be. I mean, after all, how do we learn empathy? How do we grow in our own knowledge? How can we positively impact others, but to experience even those people and beliefs contrary to our own? It's uncomfortable, but these folks learned how to do it. They lived in a dangerous, violent world, yet on the backdrop of their own European experience, as well as the colonial, some, like Roger Williams, were cutting against the grain and having a real impact. A harken back to Aaron Tippin's "I wouldn't have it any other way" from last week, or the strength and the fortitude exhibited by Martin Luther before Charles V and John Eck and Company. We take the views of Roger Williams for granted in today's world, but I think maybe we should spend more time fleshing them out. Well, the environment in which Roger Williams was speaking of, on the natives, was one that was not very different than Puritan society in a way. I mean, the natives had their views and they had their socio-ecclesiastical structure. They liked it. They wanted to keep it. It was their opiate for their masses. Just a little Karl Marx reference for you there. So the powwows, the religious leaders, were seen as healers and agents of the spirits. And they could turn into killers among the people. And they had a power and influence among the people. Even the Sachems, many of who were friendly and supportive to the English colonial cause, were reluctant to even consider Christianity. Massasoit was resistant to the English religion. He was friendly and respectful, and he was loyal and honest, but he had zero interest in conversion. Now, if you recall, Roger Williams had not only criticized the Puritans for their previous participation in Anglican services back in England, he had wanted them to repent of that sin. He had strong conviction about worship, but notice his sensitivity toward what was right was directed more toward supposedly like-minded folks than those outside of the camp. It was there, the Puritans' hypocrisy, according to their stated moral code, that he was calling out. And likewise, as we already discussed, he had come to terms with the fact that you cannot legislate conviction and conscience. I'm not saying that there should not be laws passed to encourage the public good and discourage the harmful, but he did live his convictions. He preached. He wrote. He did not hide. He did not allow himself to participate or even witness their worship services, that of the natives, or those large gatherings that were centered around games and gambling. Those activities offended his personal sensibilities and his personal convictions. Roger Williams's toleration went beyond the natives, though. When the Quakers began pouring into Massachusetts Bay, it created quite a stir. Not just socially or ecclesiastically, but legally. Remember the law from 1656? We talked about this last week, that business about warning a Quaker and then beating the Quaker and imprisoning the Quaker and cutting the ears off the Quaker and hot irons being bored through tongues of the Quaker. And then if these remedies didn't work, death itself. Well, as much as the Puritan colonies detested the Quakers and the Baptists, Roger Williams was tolerant, just like with the natives. So those shipmasters who delivered Quakers to Massachusetts Bay that were fined were not fined in Rhode Island. Even as the Quakers' books were banned by threat of fine, and publicly defending them brought the wrath of the magistrates unto banishment for that, quote, cursed sect of heretics. Williams allowed them to come in through Rhode Island. Waves of them came, even against the request of the Massachusetts Bay leadership. Williams allowed them to come unmolested. To expound a little bit about the controversy, I want to take a look at an extended quote from Thomas Jefferson Wharton Baker, where he's not only drawing out what the Quakers experienced, but what Rhode Island recognized when they allowed the Quakers to come. And so Wharton Baker wrote this, quote, "The Rhode Island answer is a landmark on the stony road of religious freedom in America, revealing as it does the innate weakness of the fortress of intolerance." Quote, Rhode Island's response was this: "We find that in those places where these people are most of all suffered to declare themselves freely and are only opposed by arguments and discourse, that there they least of all desire to come. And we are informed that they begin to loathe this place, for that they are not opposed by the civil authority, but with all patience and meekness are suffered to say over their pretended revelations and admonitions, nor are they like or able to gain many here to win their way. Surely we find that they delight to be persecuted by civil powers. And when they are so, they are like to gain more adherents by the conceit of their patient sufferings than by consent to their pernicious sayings." So first of all here, my own commentary on this, Rhode Island recognized that if you don't bother the Quakers, they kind of get bored living among you. Wharton Baker continues, "Unfortunately, this wholesome advice fell on deaf ears. When Nicholas Upshall, a weak old man of sober, unblameable life, protested that the severe punishments inflicted on the Quakers might bring a judgment upon Massachusetts, he was imprisoned and then banished. When he sought refuge at Sandwich, Governor Bradford of Plymouth gave orders that none should offer him hospitality. An Indian chief who sheltered him from the winter cold exclaimed, 'What a God have the English, who deal so with one another about the worship of their God.' Yet the invaders continued to arrive. Mary Dyer, a Quakeress from Rhode Island, was imprisoned and released only when her husband gave bond to take her home and promised not to lodge her in any town in Massachusetts and not to permit her to speak to anyone. Mary Clark, who entered the colony to deliver, quote, a message from the Lord, end quote, was given 20 lashes on her back with a whip of 3 cords, laid on with fury, and after an imprisonment of about 12 weeks, turned out into the winter cold. With the arrival at Salem of Christopher Holder and John Copeland, matters took a serious turn. These 2 zealots, who had been moved by the Lord to minister to the Puritans, soon succeeded in gathering an audience and making converts. The ministers and magistrates were determined to stamp out this spark, lest it set the whole colony on fire. In fact, the Quakers might well have gained a real foothold in this town had they been content to work in secret instead of insisting upon testifying in public. It was to testify that Holder and some of his companions one Sabbath day attended services at the meeting house. They sat quietly listening to the sermon until the minister was done, and then Holder rose to speak. He had uttered but a few words when he was seized by the hair and pulled backward from his feet, while a glove and a handkerchief were thrust in his mouth. A few days later, he and Copeland found themselves in the Boston jail, where the hangman gave them 30 lashes each with a knotted whip. Quote, fetching his strokes with the greatest strength, he could cut their flesh and put them to suffering, end quote. But suffering was not enough to restrain the Quaker missionaries. In April 1658, Thomas Harris of Barbados, who had gained access to Massachusetts by the way of Rhode Island, rose in the Boston meeting house to warn the people that their pride and oppression would bring upon them the, quote, dreadful, terrible day of the Lord, end quote. I think that's enough of a quotation. It certainly was long enough for us to understand what the temperature was in the atmosphere. It would appear that the Quakers were more adamant to share their faith with the erring Puritans than the Puritans were to share theirs with the walking dead souls of the Quaker movement. And so it was that the Indian chief who harbored Nicholas Upshall exclaimed, What a God have the English who deal so with one another about the worship of their God. Thus, further credence to the career of Nathaniel Hawthorne 2 centuries later, when he talked about the hypocrisy and the difficulty of Puritan society. Now, I bring this up again, not to denounce all of Puritan society, but rather, this is the story of Roger Williams right now, and I bring this up to highlight the strength of his character. Puritan apologists seldom bring these things up. They will address the legalism of their brand of covenantalism, and they'll address the paranoia of Salem in the 1690s. And again, for what it's worth, I do not do this to diminish their contribution, which looms very large, but to be sure to draw enough of a picture for each of us to draw conclusions of our own in our day about how we espouse our views and how we encounter others. So to close our time out together today, to close this particular chapter, there was political fallout as well as ecclesiastical from all this business with Roger Williams. He was a man of law. He observed the laws and ordinances that he was supposed to live under from a secular standpoint. Those laws and ordinances called for official recognition of a colony through the granting of a charter. Now, you remember the charter was supposed to come first, and I don't know what Roger Williams was thinking or planning, but he had purchased land probably before his banishment. But the reality is he obviously had to flee before he ever could have actually secured a charter. But he did, in fact, later secure the charter for the Providence Plantation in 1644. In the midst of the English Civil War against the protests of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Williams was recognized as a true authority on the natives of New England, and in so being recognized, they saw a value in him. There was a value in the work that he had done. They recognized his contribution to their larger understanding, the bigger picture of what colonialism looked like and what they were up against. And so there was a measure of latitude granted to him, and he got his charter. And later, the charter would expand to include a larger area. In 1647, he was finally able to expand, and the several towns around Narragansett Bay united to become the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Now, it's interesting to note that once the charter was granted, he published a book. And this is his most famous. It's called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution for Cause of Conscience. You got to hand it to him. This guy, he just couldn't stay out of trouble. So it was the same Puritan Parliament that had granted his charter over and above the misgivings of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, over and above the errors that Roger Williams had stated and written about according to their doctrine. He wrote this book, and that same Parliament now ordered all copies of this book to be burned. But Williams had already left for the colonies, and so he escaped prosecution. The colony that was now legally chartered practiced what it preached as far as freedom of conscience was concerned. It welcomed and protected those who were persecuted for their beliefs, Baptists, Quakers, Jews. In a direct response to Roger Williams' attempt to secure a charter, one in which the quote-unquote official Puritan colony saw as a competitor, the United Colonies were formed in 1643, and differences soon emerged in more ways than one. Just prior to all of these happenings, in 1641, Massachusetts Bay passed the first laws in the colonies making slavery legal. These laws went into effect in Connecticut as well with the formation of the United Colonies. So in 1652, Providence Plantations passed laws against slavery in their colony. Williams was an abolitionist. Man, he must have really bothered his neighbors. It's amazing how men with such similar doctrines had drawn such distinct and opposing views on such fundamental issues. Now, secondly, remember, we're closing our time down by making two observations. In remaining consistent with many of his views, Roger Williams was not only tolerant of Baptists, he was baptized as an adult, believer's baptism, in 1638. A denial of the efficacy of infant baptism that was held by the Puritans and denominations of his day, both Catholic and Protestant. He went farther. A few years later, Dr. John Clark established the First Baptist Church in Newport, Rhode Island, officially introducing and accepting the Baptist faith in America. Traditionally, Baptists were abused by all sides. Nobody wanted the masses to enjoy freedom of conscience. I said in the last episode that maybe he became a Baptist and I didn't know it, or that it seemed like he would. I want to clarify, Roger Williams never officially became a Baptist, as far as I know from the records. He was what some have called a seeker. Like in Boston previously, when he had refused to join their church, he remained uncommitted, unaffiliated with any church. But he did remain interested in the Baptists. I think in them he found kindred spirits, those who also celebrated the freedom of conscience that he so defended. Much more could be said about Roger Williams, but I hope that we've uncovered enough to not only help develop the intensity of life in the colonies, but also the bravery and the dedication of so many people involved. Roger Williams was a devout man, with the strength of character to live out his convictions. He was a defender of the freedom of conscience, of individual property rights, of division of church and state. He showed genuine, honest concern for the unbeliever. He was an abolitionist. He was a friend to the natives, to the Quakers, the Baptists, and others. He was a man of conviction, too. Often we equate toleration with acceptance or agreement, but that's not always a fair assessment. These positions seem so settled in our day, but they were not settled in his day. They were the types of issues that divided friends and families and communities. They were the type of issues that spilt blood. His stance and the environment that he created in Rhode Island brought many people with many diverse skills and offerings to the general population. Some even brought new flavors of dissent. Anne Hutchinson was one of those people, and we'll talk about her in our next episode. But until then, I hope that our time together in this episode has not just shed new light on an old story, but has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.